Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. I was perusing X. Why is it named X? Anyway, it's a very Generation X thing to do, I suppose. The other day, and I saw Bhaskar Sankara, of all people, ask a very crucial question. Under Biden, the Democrats had lost about 4% of their historical, relatively small voting bloc amongst the working class. By working class, of course, meaning college uneducated people, the way liberals define it. Bhaskar Sankara is never particularly clear if he's referring to the Marxist or the liberal definitions, and he's want to do that. Jacobin Magazine and the DSA are also somewhat ambivalent on which definition they're using, but that's neither here nor there for right now. Sankara asked, Harris had lost even more of a percentage among that, down 7%, although her growth in other key demographics of the Democratic coalition had grown, except for the over 65 type. And he said, why it was true that she may be able to defeat Trump with this coalition, what will that mean in 2028? And I began reflecting on the complexity of our society in response to Sankara. Sankara has a valid point. While this may be able to eke a narrow defeat out in 2024, the long-term prognosis of the Democrats, and even friends of mine have said this, one of which on my show, that they're basically hoping that Trump will run until he dies. And while the conservative movement without Trump is in shambles, literally it's held together by the cipher of a demagogue. The cipher of a bureaucrat is what holds the Democratic coalition together. Hardly a thing worth celebrating. But the complexity of the moment makes this very hard to predict. And the complexity is why, increasingly to me, we can't find leaders who lead, but find leaders who follow, because no one knows enough to actually lead all the things we expect the president to lead, particularly as the legislature, which over the past 30 years has forgone any real semblance of governing for facile ideological opposition, because it is easier to continue to get a paycheck from your donors that way. And yes, we should probably think that the paycheck provided to senators from the state is mostly from their donors anyway. After all, that's who keeps them in the ability to stay in office. The nature of this complexity, though, requires an inquiry into complexity itself and what it says about our society. And today, I come to you with a big fat stack of books to talk about this problem. As per usual, you'll find everything cited in the show notes. We're going to start with chapter 2 of the Rise and Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter, a book I reference all the time but rarely read from. A study of why complex societies collapse will begin with a clear picture of what it is that does so. What, in other words, are complex societies? What are their defining characteristics? How do they differ from simpler societies out of which they developed and to which they often revert? Are complex societies a discrete type or a stage in cultural evolution? Is there a continuum from the simple to the complex? A related question is why complex societies develop. And I add, at all. This, as noted, has been a question of perennial interest in the social sciences. Although much is now known about the evolution of complexity, there is no overall consensus about such things as why complexity emerges, why societies become stratified, why the small independent groups of early human history have given way to large interdependent states of the recent millennia. And this is without a doubt a fascinating topic, and one that offers a tempting diversion for the present work. It is a diversion that will largely have to be resisted. It cannot be wholly resisted, for the collapse may not be understood except in the context of how complex societies function and operate. And that cannot be divorced from the question of how they came into being. As any scientific endeavor, one question leads to another, one problem appears to be connected to all others, and one of the most difficult tasks is simply to draw boundaries to the inquiry. Boundaries which I personally like to explode. Back to the text. To explain the collapse, it is necessary to discuss briefly an alternative general view of how complex societies have developed and to evaluate their usefulness and relevance of these views to the problems at hand. The lively and interesting debates over what, if any, are the prime movers in the development of complexity is regrettably and only partially pertinent. Accordingly, it will be treated in only partial fashion. We're going to skip a paragraph. Complexity and the nature of complexity. This paragraph that skips, this is outlining the chapter, and we're not going to read the whole chapter. Complexity is generally understood to refer to things such as the size of society, the number and distinctiveness of its parts, and the variety of specialized social roles that it incorporates, the number of distinct social personalities present, and the variety of mechanisms for organizing these into a coherent, functioning whole. Augmenting any of these dimensions increases the complexity of the society. Hunter-gatherer societies, by way of illuminating one contrast in complexity, contain no more than a few dozen distinct social personalities, where modern European census recognizes 10,000 to 20,000 unique occupational roles. An industrial society may contain overall more than 100,000 or a million different kinds of social personalities. McGuire, 1983. Two concepts important to understanding the nature of complexity are inequity and homogeneity. Inequity may be thought of as a vertical differentiation, ranking and an unequal access to material and social resources. Homogeneity is a subtler concept. It refers to a number of distinctive parts. Heterogeneity is a subtler concept. It refers to a number of distinctive parts. Are components to a society, and at the same time in the ways in which the population is distributed among these parts. A population that is divided equally among an occupation roles in society is a homogeneously distributed. The converse brings about increasing heterogeneity and complexity. See Tainter, 1979-1978. A society with a great deal of heterogeneity then is one that is complex. Inequity and heterogeneity are interrelated, but in part respond to different processes and are not always positively correlated in the socio-political evolution. In early civilizations, for example, inequity tended to be initially high and heterogeneity low. Through time, inequity decreased and heterogeneity grew as multiple hierarchies would develop. Johnson relates this process as a growth in the amounts of information that must be processed by society, with greater quantity and variety of information requiring greater social complexity. Complex societies tend to be what Simon has called nearly decomposable systems. That is, they are at least partially built up on social units that are themselves potentially stable and independent, and indeed at one time may have been so. Thus, a newly established state may include several formerly independent villages or ethnic groups, or an empire may incorporate previously established states. To the extent that these states, ethnic groups, and villages retain the potential for independence and stability, the collapse process may result in reversion, decomposition to these building blocks of complexity. Simpler societies. The citizens of modern complex societies usually do not realize that we are an anomaly of history. Throughout several million years, there's recognizable humans are known to have lived. The common political unit was a small autonomous community, acting independently and largely self-sufficient. Robert Carneiro has estimated that 99.8% of human history has been dominated by these autonomous local communities. It has only been within the last 6,000 years that something unusual has emerged. The hierarchical, organized, interdependent states that are a major reference for our contemporary political experience. Complex societies, once established, tend to expand and dominate, so that today they are in control of most of the Earth's lands and peoples and are perpetually vexed by those that are still beyond their reach. A dilemma arises from this. We today are familiar mainly with the political forms that are an oddity of history, and we think of these as normal, and we view as alien the majority of human experience. It is a very little surprise that collapse is viewed so fearfully. The small autocephalous communities that have dominated our history were not homogeneous. The degree of variation among these societies is substantial. Although these societies would be characterized in comparison to ourselves as simple, they nonetheless display variations in size, complexity, ranking, economic differentiation, and other factors. It is from these variations that many of our theories of cultural evolution have developed. Simpler societies are, of course, comparatively smaller. They form a handful of a few thousand persons and are united within our social political units and companies in correspondingly small territories. Such societies tend to be organized on the basis of kinship, with status familiar and centered on the individual. One can know most everyone within such a society and can categorize each person individually in terms of position and distance in a web of kinship relations. And if you listen to my Patreon, I've actually read the Marshall Sahlins work on kinship relations, explaining that that's not just blood ties. It's much more complicated than that. Leadership in the simplest societies tends to be minimal, impersonal and charismatic, and exists only for special purposes. Hierarchical control is not institutionalized, but limited to a defined spheres of activity at specific times, and rests substantially on persuasion. Sahlins has captured the essence of the petty chieftains in these societies. And we're going to get to Sahlins in a minute. The holder of each position is a spokesman, a master of ceremonies, and likewise has little influence, few functions, and no privileges or coercive power. Other than from such a leader, no Sahlins, and everyone else does as he pleases. Equity in these societies lies in direct individual access to the resources that sustains life, in mobility and the option to simply withdraw from the untenable social situations, and in conventions that prevent economic accumulation and impose sharing. Leaders, where they exist, are constrained by existing authority, amassing wealth, or acquiring excessive prestige. Where there are differences in control of economic resources, there must be exercised generously. You talk about the generosity. You see this in literature, generosity of ancient leaders. Personal politics ambitions is either restrained from expression or channeled to fulfill a public good. The route as an elevated social position is to acquire a surplus of subsistence resources and to distribute these in such a way that one establishes prestige in the community and creates a following and a faction. Where several ambitious individuals follow the course, there is a constant competition and jockeying for position. This results in an unstable, fluctuating political environment in which ephemeral leaders rise and fall, and in which the death of a leader brings about the demise of his faction and a wholesome political regrouping. Native Melanesians often refer to such ambitious individuals as a big man, a term that has achieved anthropological currency, seen Sahlins, 1963. A big man strives to build a following, but is never permanently successful. His influence is limited to his faction. Extending that influence means extending the size of the following. At the same time, the loyalty of his existing followers must be constantly renewed through generosity. Herein lies a tension. As resources are allocated to expanding a faction, they're available to retain previous loyalties must decline. As big man attempts to expand his sphere of influence, he is likely to lose the springboard that makes that possible. Big men systems contain thus a built-in structural limitations on their scope, extent, and durability. Other simple societies are organized at a higher level of political differentiation. There are permanent positions of rank to which authority must reside in an office rather than in an individual, and to which inherent general powers of command. Chiefly rank is often hereditary or nearly so, and equality pervades the societies which tends to be larger and more densely populated to a degree which coordinate with their increased complexity. And these centrally focused, chiefly societies, political organization extends beyond the community level. According to economic, political, and ceremonial life transcends purely local concerns. In the chiefdoms in Polynesia, entire islands would often be integrated into a single polity. There is a political economy in which rank conveys the authority to direct labor and economic surplus. Labor may be mobilized to engage in public works, agricultural facilities, monuments, etc. Of an impressive scale, economic specialization, exchange, and coordination are characteristic features. Social status in these are more complex societies will still be mirrored more in kinship, tend to be more established and continuing rather than variable from the perspective of different individuals. As complexity in the number of members grow, individuals must increasingly be socially organized so that their appropriate behavior between the persons is prescribed more by impersonal structures of society and less by kin relations. The epitome of this is position of the chief, and which is now a true office extending beyond the lifetime of an individual leader. The authority to command in such chiefdoms is not unrestrained. The ruler is limited by his or her actions by the moorings of kinship, by possessing not merely a monopoly of force, but only by marginal advantage. Claims of followers obligate a chief to respond positively to requests. Chiefly generosity is the basis of politics and economics. Downward distribution of amassed resources ensures loyalty. Chiefly ambitions like those of big men are structurally constrained. Too many allocations of resources to the chiefly apparatus and too much return to the local level engender resistance. The consequence is for that the chiefdom tends to undergo cycles of centralization and decentralization, much like the big man systems, but at a much higher cutoff point. Chiefdoms display many points of similarity to more complex state-organized systems, but are still regarded by most anthropologists as firmly within the category of simple or primitive societies. Chiefdoms are limited by obligation of kinship and by lack of true coercive force. By the time human organizations emerged that today would be called a state, these limitations have been surpassed. Anthropologists have had some difficulty defining the concept of state. This is something that seems clearly different from the simplest autocephalous human societies, but specifying or enumerating the differences has proven to be an elusive goal. Many anthropologists, despite this difficulty, insist that states are qualitatively different kinds of society, so the transition from tribal to state societies represents the great divide of human history. The emphasis on qualitative difference among societies, as illustrated above, leads many scholars to subdivide simpler societies into what they thought to be discrete types or levels of complexity. Whether this is more profitable to view socio-political evolution as traversing a continuum of complexity or as characterized by discrete stages or levels is a matter pertinent to understanding collapse and will be discussed later. And we're not going to get to that. Last I'm going to read here, since I've been reading for a while. States to begin with are territorially organized. That is to say, membership is at least partially determined by birth or residence in a territory rather than by real or fictive kin relations. Illustrating this, as pointed out by Sir Henry Sumner Maine, was the transformation of the Merovingian king of the Franks to the Capetian king of France. The territorial basis both reflects and influences the nature of statehood. States contrast with relatively complex tribal societies, chiefdom, in a number of ways. In states, a ruling authority monopolizes sovereign and delegates all power. The ruling class tends to be professional and largely divorced from the bonds of kinship. The ruling class supplies the personnel for the government, which is a specialized decision-making organization with a monopoly on force and with the power to draft for war or work, levy and collect taxes, and decree and enforce laws. So we got three definitions of the state. The government is legitimately constituted, which is to say that a common society-wide ideology exists that serves in part to validate the political organization of society. And states, of course, are generally larger and more populous than tribal societies, so that social categorization, stratification, and specialization are both possible and necessary. States tend to be overwhelmingly concerned with maintaining the territorial integrity. Cough, cough, cough. That is, indeed, one of the primary characteristics. States are the only kind of human society that does not ordinarily undergo short-term cycles of formation and dissolution. States are internally differentiated, as an illustration at the beginning of this chapter makes clear. Occupational specialization is the prime characteristic and is often reflected in the pattern of resonance. Emil Durkheim, in a classic work, recognizes that evolution from primitive to complex society witnessed the transformation of groups organized from the basis of what he labeled mechanical solidarity, homogeneity, a lack of cultural and economic differentiation among members of society, low class differences, as what a Marxist would notice, to those based on organic solidarity, heterogeneity, cultural and economic differentiation requiring interaction and greater cohesiveness, aka class differences being more significant. Organic solidarity has increased throughout history and in states has a preponderant form of organization. By the virtue of territorial extensiveness, states are often differentiated not only economically but also culturally and ethnically. Both economic and cultural heterogeneity appear to be functionally related to the centralization and administration that are the defining characteristics of states. Despite the institutionalized authority structure as an ideological basis and as a monopoly of force, the rulers of states share at least one thing with chiefs and big men. They need to establish and constantly reinforce legitimacy. And complex as well as simpler societies, leadership activities, and societal resources must be continuously devoted to this purpose. Hierarchy and complexity, as one notes, are rare in human history, and when present, require constant reinforcement. No social ladder is ever far from the need to validate the position and policy, and no hierarchical society can be organized without explicit provisions for that need. Legitimacy is the belief of the populace and the elites that rule is proper and valid, that the political world is as it should be. It pertains to individual rulers, to decisions, to broad policies, to parties, and to entire forms of government. The support that members are willing to extend to the political system is essential for its survival. Decline in support will not necessarily lead to the fall of a regime, cough, cough. For a certain extent, coercion can replace commitment and ensure compliance. Coercion, though, is costly and an ineffective strategy which can never be completely or permanently successful. And even when coercion decline in popular support below some critical minimum leads to and infallibly to political failure. Establishing more validity is less costly and more effective approach. Hence the move from high, what Althusser would call repressive forces to high ideological forces. Complex societies are focused on a center, which may not be located physically where it is literally implied, but which is a symbolic source of the framework of society. It is not only a location of legal and governmental institutions, but it is a source of order and a symbol of moral authority and social continuity. The center partakes the nature of the sacred. In this sense, every complex society has an official religion. Oh, except us. The moral authority and sacred aura of the center are not only essential in maintaining complex societies, but are crucial in their emergence. One critical impediment to the development of complexity in stateless societies was the need to integrate many localized autonomous units, which would each have their own particular interests, feuds, and jealousies. A ruler drawn from one of these units is automatically suspect by the others, who rightly fear favoritism towards his or her natal group and locality, particularly in dispute resolution. This problem has crippled many modern African nations. The solution to the structural limitation was to explicitly link leadership in early complex societies to the supernatural. See Egypt. When a leader is imbued with an aura of sacred neutrality, his identification with his natal group and territory can be superseded by ritual sanctioned authority, which rises over purely local concerns. Now, we are not as ruled by religion today in our hyper-complex society, and that's something that conservatives often lament because it does rightly imply more and more heterogeneity in the social system. Now, heterogeneity, as often spoken about, does not automatically equal, as Tainter points out, high inequality, and high inequality does not automatically equal heterogeneity, but together they form a complex society. And we live in a very complex society. Despite our notions and pretensions to equality, which may function the role that religion had in the past, thus making the people sort of their own source of legitimacy, We also see that this is very fraught in that it creates more inequality than existed in more formerly unequal systems. After all, these democracies are some of the most unequal societies in economic terms that have ever existed. Why then is this the way it is, and how do we respond to that? And why would such leaders lose more and more of the workers? Sankara is right that this is a crisis of legitimacy, but what we see is the complexity of society and mutual interest in particular complex niches means that this is a given. This is part of why class conflict emerges in these societies, something that Marx probably had a feeling for, but didn't work out in the way Tainter does. Now, let's get into this a little bit. One of the ironies of complex societies is that we move from personalism to atomized individualism. And this is a way to like focus on things that we can comprehend, individual personalities, versus what is harder to comprehend, the interaction of aggregate systems. And we see this in a lot of ideological critique today, even amongst people who should know better, materialists who call themselves materialist, historical materialists, but then focus on the ideology and ideas alone of individual leaders, as if those ideology and ideas did not come from specific material contexts. Now we go back to Saint Bakhtin. We're from the book M. Bakhtin, Speech and Other Genres. And we're from the essay from notes made in 1970 to 1971. The false tendency towards reducing everything to a single consciousness, towards dissolving in it the other's consciousness while being understood. The principal advantage of outsidedness, spatially, temporally, and nationally. One cannot understand understanding as emotional empathy, as the placement of the self in the other's position, or the loss of one's own position. This is required only for peripheral aspects of understanding. One cannot understand understanding as a translation from the other's language into one's own. To understand a given text as the author himself understood it, but our understanding can and should be better. Powerful and profound, creativity is largely unconscious and polysemic. Through understanding, and it's supplemented by consciousness, and the most simplicity of its meaning is revealed. Thus, understanding supplements the text. It is inactive and also created by nature. Creativity continues creativity and multiplies the artistic wealth of humanity. The co-creativity of those who understand. Understanding and evaluation. Understanding is impossible without evaluation. Understanding cannot be separated from evaluation. They are simultaneous and constitute a unified integral act. The person who understands approaches the work from his own already formed world view, from his own viewpoint, from his own position. These positions determine his evaluations to a certain degree, but they themselves do not always stay the same. They are influenced by artwork, which always introduces something new. Only when a position is dogmatically inert is there nothing new to be revealed in the work. The dogmatist gains nothing. He cannot be enriched. The person who understands must reject the possibility of changing and abandoning his already pre-prepared worldviews and positions. In the act of understanding, a struggle occurs which results in mutual change and enrichment. A meeting with the great human beings as something that determines, obligates, and unites is the highest moment of understanding. But we see here in Bakhtin that it is understanding the wholeness and community and conceptualizing that in almost a personalist and dialogic way that enables us to stop reducing everything to single consciousness. But the tendency to reduce everything to singular consciousness and atomize them and treat them as independent variables is itself a symptom of overcomplexity. After all, if we weren't overly complex, why would we need to do this? Furthermore, we have a tendency to oversimplify the simple past. And this also leads to problems. This brings us to Marshall Sahlins directly. And here I will read from Apologies to Thucydides, Understanding History as Culture, and Vice Versa, Marshall Sahlins. We're in Chapter 1, the Peloponnesian War. For Athens, the economism was far more radical because it was chimeristic, articulated to the development of money and markets. Cough, cough. In regard to 5th century Athens differed greatly from other Hellenic cities, where it was not altogether unique. A large portion of the large Athenian population was dependent on monetary earnings for livelihood, many of them through public employ, thus adding popular voice to the state's quest for revenues. The so-called old oligarch complained of the numerous common people who, quote, think themselves worthy of taking money for singing, running, dancing, sailing ships, so they become wealthy and the wealthy poorer. Xena, Constitution of Athens. All this came to a critical pass in the Peloponnesian War as the culmination of turn of thaliocracy began in the Persian War. In effect, trade followed the flag rather than vice versa. Athens became the center of the Aegean commerce only after it established itself militarily and politically as a dominant power, unquote, quoting Meyer, 1998. The Athenians claimed much as themselves when defending creation of their empire before the Spartans in 1432 BCE. We were compelled to advance our empire to its present state, they said, first of all by fear, although latter by honor too, and lastly by profit, Thucydides. The continuing war with the Persians was the fear. The assumption of the leadership of the Hellenes was the honor, and the profit developed from the strategy of overcommitment to naval power relative to Athens' initial resources and techniques. A political overreach led to an economic takeoff. So observes Oliver Picard in the connection with Themistocles' shipbuilding project, beginning with the 2,000 triremes of 483 and 482. Quote, the armaments decided upon are of magnitude. It must be underlined that are beyond the city's capacities of mobilizing, and techniques to be put in place are fraught with long-term consequences. Doubtly a calculating mind, such as tradition attributes to Themistocles, would be conscious that he was not simply producing a circumferential measure, that he was engaging the city in a policy of longue durée. Unquote. From Oliver Picard. Maneuvering the Athenian assembly into a state policy of maritime expansion, Themistocles thus destines Athens to a brilliant economic center. Themistocles persuaded the people each year to construct and add 20 triremes to the fleet already possessed, and also to remove taxes upon metics, foreigners, and artisans, in order that the great crowds of people might stream into the city from every quarter, and that the Athenians might easily produce labor for the numbers of crafts. Both these policies he considered to be most useful in building up the city's naval forces. By the mid-5th century, manufacture, immigration, and population were all flourishing, so the commerce by which the city imported the basic means of subsistence, manufacture, and luxury consumption, including timber, pitch, sails, ropes, copper, tin, iron, that built the ships that declared the seas of all competition, piratical and Persian. Likewise, all sorts of deluxe goods, quote, whenever the delicacy in Sicily, Italy, Cyprus, Egypt, Lydia, Pontus, the Peloponnese, or elsewhere, all have been brought together in one place by the virtue of neighbor power, the Constitution of Athens, Chapter 2. Xenophon. Critically, the staple grains in which the city survived came from the farthest reaches of Athenian power, Sicily, Egypt, and the greatest source, the Crimea. As it was not situated in the most fertile grain-growing area. That feels familiar. Athens was far from able to feed her burgeoning population from her own countryside, even less so during the phases of the Peloponnesian War, when the Attic peasantry withdrew into the city. In some years, grain imports may have reached 1 million medoni, about 1.5 million bushels, enough to feed 250,000 people. It is necessary to suppose from this, as Cornford did in the well-known argument in 1971, that the need for the Crimean and Sicilian grain was the reason d'etre for the Athenian Empire. More the other way around, the empire was the reason of the need. And such a dependence on trade, all those living by it, as well as the state, grew increasingly attentive to the main chance, especially in the decades of the Peloponnesian War. Quote, in the days of Pericles, and more intensely during the Great Economic War, change began to take place where economic factors took an ever-increasing importance in the life of the polis. End quote. In the notorious passages of the Constitution of Athens, As Moses Finley deemed it, invoking a preposterous arithmetic, Aristotle wrote that the empire had, quote, provided common people with an abundance of income. More than 20,000 men were maintained out of the tribune and taxes of the allies. The arithmetic is preposterous, according to Finley, because the state payroll summarized by Aristotle left out the navy amongst other considerable expenses. But this only underscores that Aristotle had the key to the unique Athenian system, the principal payment to the citizens for public service and for performing duties as citizens. Aristophanes' wasps, knights, and other economies, Finley points out, were all about the decadent economic system in which the milking of the state by the general populace was complemented by the avaricious politicians who were dubious origins in trade, who made venal interests of this industry by means of their own advancements. Quote, you know that the I will never betray Athenian rabble, and I will always fight for the plebeians people, wasps, Aristophanes. These are the new politicians of 5th century Athens, as Robert Connor, 1992, designated them. Some of them too young and many too nouveau riche. These were the people from whom the 420s or earlier replaced the old-time Poles of the aristocratic lineage, such as Pericles, whose own authority had been backed by landed wealth and a network of powerful friends. Here were the likes of Cleon the tanner, Hypabolus the lamp maker, Cleophon the lyre maker, and other such men of the agora who as demagogues are leaders of the people, a term apparently without prejudice, but indeed implying a rhetorical skill that could carry the democratic assembly, were thus transmitting the force of popular venality as well as their own into the policies of the state. A caveat, not to think of the ancient simplicity, was finished by the 5th century. Consider the put down of the pandering Cleon, Pampeleon, and his rival Sachasmonger and Aristide's Knight, where the former promises the demos, the people, he will rule over Greece and make big money judging law cases in Arcadia. Telling how Cleon is only in it for his own corrupt profit, the Sachasmonger warns that if the demos, lately forced into the city by war, ever goes back to the country again and lives in peace and takes fresh courage from eating grits and making acquaintances of pressed olives, that he will realize that this benefits you have cheated him out of with your state pay. Then you will find him coming back, a fine rustic, hunting for vote tokens to use against you. Knights Aristophanes. There would be other famous versions of this nostalgia for receding virtues of production for use, limited to what was needed for the good life of the household and to the city, by contrast to the unnatural pecunity of trade, whose appetites for gain knew no bounds. Referring to Aristotle's Politics, Calpurnius asked, to what purpose did he develop the theorem comprising the origins of the family and state, solely designed to demonstrate that human wants and needs are not boundless and thus useful things that are not intrinsically scarce? The explanation is obvious. The two policy problem, trade and price, were pressing for an answer. Unless the question of commercial trade and the setting of prices could be linked to the requirements of communal existence and its self-sufficiency, there is no rational way of judging either. Commercial trade, or in our terms, market trade, arose as a burning issue of the time, and it was disturbingly novel. 1957, called Polanyi. Marx spoke of the sublimity of ancient conceptions that made man the aim of production in comparison with the modern world in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. The formulation is perhaps too binary to accommodate a classical Greece where good old days have not yet given way to the interest in accumulation as such, Marx's MCM circuit, as the hegemonic principle of the economy, but Athens dependent on seaborne trade and tributes and her citizens' dependence on the city for income all intensified the military expenses of securing and defending the empire, and have made the economic calculation a main principle of the city's historical action. One hesitates to say rational calculations in connection to the Sicilian expedition, but Thucydides does note how eager the populace was for it, and how it saw a fine opportunity to earn wages at the moment, and conquest would supply a never-ending fund of pay for the future. Thus, largely textual analysis of Thucydides, Lisa Collett sees the progressive transformation of Athenian empire into pecuniary purposes. Quote, power increasingly becomes means to economic end. The Athenians' transformation of their system of control into economic arche, empire. Thus, the emergence of materialism as a culturally specific formation that I was talking about. not the economic determination of history, the historical determination of economism. And Marshall Sahlins, Apology to Thucydides, chapter 1, Peloponnesian War. Read this book. So we have three visions of what's going on here, and I will tie it back to Harris, I promise. We've gone through a very broad scale notion of what human complexity is. We see how this reflects on literary focuses on the individual, which also reflects social focuses on the individual, and how increasingly complex societies are presented as atomized. You can see Hobbes for this again. And we can see that these traits are not new. They're not unique to the 20th century or to capitalism. They emerge early on in the emergence of complex societies, of which Sahlins shows us in the development of the Athenian Empire, where the needs of the Athenian Empire were because the empire needed them to maintain an empire, thus constantly increasing its energy needs to feed its own complexity. Thus, it's a cost associated with constant growth. Let us now turn to something that you probably would not expect of this lecture I'm giving to you, my colleagues and comrades and fans, but one that one would normally expect of me: the culture of narcissism. On the socialization of reproduction and the collapse of authority, chapter 7 in the culture of narcissism. I'm going to read a lot of this. And then we'll return back to the Harris problem. The socialization of working man, the survival of any form of human society, depends on the production of the necessities of life and the reproduction of the labor force itself. Until recently, the work of reproduction, which includes not merely the propagation of the species, but the care and nurturing of the young, took place largely in the family. See those kinship bonds. Although Lasch has a more limited view of kinship than most anthropologists, but he's still, broadly speaking, right if you actually based on an anthropological view of kinship. The factory system established in the 19th century socialized production but left the other functions of the family intact. The socialization of production, however, proved to be a prelude to the socialization of reproduction itself. The assumption of child-rearing functions by surrogate parents responsible not to the family but to the state, to private industry, and to their own codes of professional ethics. In the course of bringing culture to the masses, an advertising industry, the mass media, the health and welfare services, and other agencies of mass tuition took over many of the socializing functions of the home and brought ones that remains under the direction of the modern science and technology. It is in this light that we should see the school's appropriation of many of the training functions formerly carried out by the family, including manual training, household arts, instruction in manners and morals, and sex education. Social, political, and industrial changes, announced a pair of leading educators in 1918, have forced upon the school the responsibilities formerly laid upon the home. Once the school had mainly to teach the elements of knowledge, now it has charge with the physical, mental, and social training of the child as well. And we've expanded this since 1918 dramatically. That's me talking. These words reflected a consensus amongst the helping professions that the family could no longer provide for its own needs. And I'm going to add, it couldn't. We'll come back to that. This is a weakness in Lasch here, but Lasch has this elsewhere. Doctors, psychiatrists, and child development experts, spokesmen for the juvenile courts, marriage counselors, leaders of public hygiene movements all said the same thing, usually reserving to their own professions, however, the leading role in the care of the young. Ellen Richards, founder of the Modern Professions of Social Work, argued, quote, "In the social republic, the child of the future citizen is an asset of the state, not the property of its parents. Hence, its welfare is a direct concern of the state. Experts in mental health, seeking to expand their own jurisdiction, deplored the harm, the oft well-nigh irreparable, which best intentioned parents may do to children. Many reformers despaired of instilling in parents the principles of mental health and maintaining that, quote, the only practical and effective way to increase the mental health of the nation is through the school system. Homes are too inaccessible." But why were they inaccessible, we might ask? Opponents of child labor argued along the same lines. Convinced that pure immigrant parents exploited their children's labor at every opportunity, they demanded not only state prohibition of child labor, but also the placement of children under the custody of the school and local parentists. Similarly, those who dealt with juvenile delinquency saw broken or otherwise flawed homes as the breeding grounds of crime and tried to bring juvenile offenders under the protective custody of the courts. Parents' rights in their children, according to the new ideology of social reform, depended on the extent of their willingness to cooperate with officials of the juvenile court. Quote, the competent parent all aid should be given, wrote Sophonis B. Pinkerage and Adolf Abbott, but to the degraded parent, no concession should be made. By the same logic, as another spokesman for the helping professions explained, refusal to cooperate with the courts and other welfare agencies proved that the parent, quote, had a warped view of authority and is therefore unable to make use of social resources, thus forfeiting his right to his children, or at least raising strong doubts that his competence as a parent. Reformers conceived of the socialization of the working man as an alternative to class conflict. Bing, 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 bing. Quote, if men of any country are taught from childhood to consider themselves as members of a class, wrote Edwin L. Arp, characteristically addressing himself to the professional man as well as to lower orders, then it will be impossible to avoid social friction, class hatred, and class conflict. A spokesman for the social gospel, Arp went on to explain that the church could socialize the worker more effectively than the labor unions, for they are class conscious and selfish, while the church, on the other hand, is conscious of the world kingdom of righteousness, peace, and joy, and in most cases at least, is hopefully altruistic, unquote. Almost everyone agreed that the family promoted a narrow, parochial, selfish, and individualistic mentality and thus impeded the development of sociability and cooperation. This reasoning led inexorably to the conclusion that the outside agencies had replaced the family, especially the working class family, which so many reformers nevertheless wished to preserve and strengthen. As the school was reluctantly, quote, taking the place of the home, according to Ellen Richards, this was because, quote, the personal point of view inculcated by the modern conditions of strife for money, just as surely as it must have been by the barbarian struggle in pre-civilized days, must be supplanted by the broader view of majority welfare. And the iron law of social evolution dictated the subordination of the individual to the destiny of the race. Now, I don't agree with everything Lasch is implying here about the idealization of the family during the 19th century. Lasch has a particular nostalgia for it at times. He also, admittedly, in his Haven and Heartland World, admits that there are problems with it and that it becomes overburdened by being so focused of the private sphere and eventually the public sphere too, in so much that everything else is commodified. But this is also emergent from complexity, as there are more complex positions and less money to go around, and the needs of maintaining that complexity has costs. Those costs must be offset somewhere, usually in the labor of someone else. So getting more and more people to enter the workforce and abandoning the banality of 1950s home life, which was a very brief period for women in the grand schema of things and didn't apply to everyone, but only usually the petite bourgeoisie and professionals. But this complexity has roots here, and it has alienated the working class from any notion of upper leadership, and it should. But where is the working class to go? To demagoguery? To whatever? After all, as Tainter says in an interview, that the tendency of complexity to lead to demagogues is to paper over the complexity. It doesn't actually resolve it. Sovereignty is not a force that actually reduces complexity, despite its seeming attempts to do so as a concept. This is the problem with such idealism. But this reduces us to the mere self and the atomized self at that, because we can understand ourselves, complex society, and we refer to systems. We can talk about them all the time. People do see on TikTok, the system. But the system does not articulate the working of the systems, nor does the neo-nominalism of blaming those who instantiate the system, often who are dead by the time you encounter it. The structuralization of capital means that you don't just get rid of individual capitalists, even though you should hate them. Sometimes that can be used to give them a pass, but often the personalization is used to give other elites a pass. Don't be surprised by that game in a complex society. So where does this leave Harris and the working class, or us today? Well, one, we have a society that is overcomplicated and cannot deliver on its own promises. Two, it is increasingly obsessed with metrics as a way out of its complication. By only looking at the numbers, we can not deal with the social conditions which underlie the numbers. We rely on polls instead of stories about narratives because we don't believe the narratives and we think the numbers tell us truths. Well, the numbers make it harder to lie, but you can still lie with numbers, as any mathematician or statistician will tell you. It is a false simplification. But in an overly complex system, what else are you going to do to understand it, particularly when specialists really only understand their specialization and increasingly outsource other thinking to other groups and people? This interdependence is always true. It's true in simple societies too, but the scale of it means that no one really grasps the situation. Thus, things seem impossible. The slow cancellation of the future, which is really your own ability, our inability to make a new future, is created by the fact that the system eats more and more up to maintain its own complexity. Capitalism is one of the most complexity building systems we've ever known. That's not a critique that Marx makes, but it's a critique that I make in addition to ones that Marx makes. But this is a deeper logic than this logic of capital accumulation. It's the logic of surplus in general and of surplus-inspired complexity. The promise of socialism was to be that by using the development of all the prior surplus and re-equalizing it out and empowering everyone as part of the system who produces it, that we'd be able to take the reins of this system and manage it rationally. Marx may have had too much faith in centralization as a means of efficiency, but he really did believe that we could take these reins and simplify the system from the, quote, anarchy or chaos of the market, unquote. The complications breed the chaos. What is simple is understandable, but reality is not simple, and neither are complex systems. So Harris, of course, now must maintain power by really not leading but following. And this is an increasing theme in our leaders. They give us exactly what they think we want, but we don't want it. We can't articulate what we want because we can't grasp the entire complexity of the system. And it manifests itself as simple statements, bromides, and whatever the fuck is going on X or TikTok or whatever social media, which is trying to oversimplify these complex situations and deal with them totally in forms of superficial presentations and brandings of ideology. In some ways, even what we do here is still akin to that. We have to move beyond it. But that requires willingness to be a generalist, to radically simplify as best you can, and maintain which complex systems you can selectively. That's not an easy task. And as Tainter points out, most societies have failed to do it. And in that note, protect your peace and take care. I'm going to put the citations of these books in the show notes. I know there was a lot of reading today. I hope they make the next one a little bit lighter. But there is a direct relationship between the complexity of the system and increasingly hollowing out and presenting yourself as a simple focus, because a hollowed self is understandable, atomized, and perfectly comprehensible to yourself, you hope. Although you exist in dialogue with the complexity too, and thus you can't really escape it. As Adorno says, a wrong life cannot be lived rightly. Have a good day.